If you've ever worked with SharePoint, then you're probably already familiar with versioning. It's one of the most commonly used features and is available to you no matter what edition of SharePoint you have. What's important to realize about versioning is that while it can grant you limited page and document level protection, it really can't do much more than that. In other words, when you think about versioning, it's very wrong to think about backup and restore. So versioning is just turned on or off manually within the settings of each list or library. And if you're working in a document library, you can configure more granular options for versioning. Just turning it on, though, isn't enough. As a best practice, you should always set a limit on the number of versions that are retained. As a special point, I want to make you fully aware that each version of a document is a full copy when you have versioning on. Now, to put this in perspective, let's imagine that you have a simple text file that's 1 kilobyte in size, and that size remains constant. Let's also assume that you have that file stored in a document library in which versioning is turned on, and if over time that text file is edited 100 times, then you end up with 100 files that are 1 kilobyte in size each, and therefore the file that was originally taking up only 1 kilobyte of space is now taking up 100 kilobytes of space. And while it's not much space, it is taking up 100 times more space than it originally was. So, similar to the option you see here, where if we have a 1 kilobyte file but 400 different copies of it, that file is now taking up 400 kilobytes of space. So I'm not telling you not to use versioning. I'm telling you that you should use versioning where it's appropriate, but know the implications of not limiting the number of versions that are retained. Always set a limit. It's a best practice. In my own experience, I've actually come across a photo library of large, high-quality TIFF files that actually did average about 50 megabytes each. Now, SharePoint works fine with files that are 50 megabytes. You can go up to 2 gigabytes as a hard limit. But when versioning is on, and these images are frequently edited, then you end up with multiple copies of each image. And I found such a library in one of my past projects, and performance was awful. Managing the photos was a horrible experience. The backup restore process took hours, and it was actually slowing down other sites in the same web application because of the load that was placed on that particular application pool. Please take care to place some governance around versioning to limit the number of versions that are retained. Now, the most difficult part about this is actually enforcing it, because it has to be turned on per list, per library. You might have thousands of libraries across your SharePoint deployment that make use of versioning. So without some automated reporting mechanism, there's really no way to tell where it's turned on and how limits are configured if they are. You could write a PowerShell script that runs on a set schedule to give you this kind of a report. Go out and find all the libraries in my farm, let me know if versioning's turned on, let me know if limits have been set, but there's really nothing built in that would help with this. Your only real option would be to visit every single library manually and check yourself. So again, versioning, wonderful option, great feature, definitely helps for collaboration, but it's not really a backup restore solution. In our governance team side, since we have multiple people working together for collaboration, for a small group of people, perhaps a short period of time, depending on how long the project runs, we're going to go ahead and make sure versioning is turned on in our document library. So I'm going to click on Documents, go into my Library tab on the ribbon, and select Library Settings on the ribbon. And under General Settings, the second link here is Versioning Settings. And right now versioning is not turned on, but I could go ahead and turn on major versions or major and minor if I was worried about publishing and controlling who can see major versions versus minor versions. For an internal team where we don't really care about minor major differences, we're just going to turn on major versions, and I'm going to make sure that I limit the number of major versions that I have. Keep the last 10 major versions. Now, I could leave this empty, but then it would not put a limit on the number of versions that are retained for any document in the library altogether. Now, if I have just one document like I do now, probably not such a big deal. But when I have 10, 20, 30, 100, 200, 400, 500 documents in a library, you can imagine that gets out of control very quickly. So as a best practice, always limit the number of major versions. And if you're using minor versions, make sure that you limit that number as well. Once I've set these settings, I can select OK, and now I've turned on versioning for that document library. Counter to that, we have another site, which is our public-facing website, Globomantics. And the idea here is that we're not going to maintain several different versions of content out here. We might work on an internal server and then publish to the public-facing website. So in this case, we don't really need versioning on the external website. So just to give you an idea of how we could do that, we would go into some document library, any list or any library, go into the settings and just check on versioning and make sure that it's off. Instead of major and minor, we'll turn that off to no versioning and select OK. So now every time somebody edits and adds a document to that document library, it will actually overwrite the previous version.